He grew up in Perth, middle-class family, decent student, played rugby on weekends. At 17, he decided he wanted to serve. Nothing exceptional about the decision. Thousands of Australian kids make the same choice every year.
He joined the Australian Defence Force in 2003, passed basic training without incident, and showed aptitude for leadership. His instructors noted him as competent, reliable, and disciplined. He was the kind of soldier who follows orders, respects the chain of command, and takes the work seriously. Within 3 years, he applied for Special Air Service selection. The Special Air Service Regiment is Australia's most elite unit, modeled on the British SAS, one of the most respected special operations forces in the world.
The selection course breaks most candidates. Physical endurance, psychological pressure, navigation under extreme conditions, constant evaluation. He made it through. Not at the top of his class, not a standout, but he passed. He earned the Sandy Beret. He became an SAS operator.
For the next 4 years, he trained close quarters combat, demolitions, advanced reconnaissance, counterterrorism. He deployed to Iraq in 2007, performed his duties, and returned home. Standard rotation. Nothing in his record suggested anything other than a competent special operations soldier doing difficult work in a combat zone. In 2009, he deployed to Afghanistan. This is where the ordinary soldier encountered the gateway that would transform him into something else entirely. The war in Afghanistan had, by 2009, entered a different phase. The initial invasion had toppled the Taliban government. The conventional warfare phase had ended. What remained was counterinsurgency, a grinding, ambiguous conflict where the enemy wore no uniform, where villages could be friendly one week and hostile the next, where every compound search could end in contact. Special operations forces were at the center of this phase. SAS squadrons rotated through Afghanistan on 4-month deployments, conducting direct action missions, partnered operations with Afghan forces, and what the military called targeted operations, raids on suspected Taliban commanders, weapons caches, insurgent cells. The operational tempo was intense. Multiple missions occurred each week. There was limited oversight in remote areas. Small teams operated with significant autonomy.
The institutional environment created specific conditions. First, the mission itself created moral ambiguity. Unlike conventional forces holding territory or building infrastructure, SAS teams were specifically tasked with finding and eliminating targets.
The metric of success was enemy killed or captured. This created an incentive structure where results mattered more than methods. Second, the partnership with Afghan forces introduced a cultural variable. Afghan National Army soldiers and local militia fighters operated under different rules of engagement and different cultural norms about prisoners and combatants. Australian soldiers working alongside these forces encountered practices that would be violations under Australian military law, but were accepted by their partners. Third, the isolation of the teams created what military psychologists call small group dynamics, the tendency of isolated units to develop their own internal norms that diverge from official policy. When the only people who witness your actions are the same 12 soldiers you've deployed with for months, institutional oversight becomes theoretical rather than actual. Fourth, the institutional culture of elite units created competitive pressure. ASS squadrons are organized into smaller troops. These troops compete for mission assignments, for recognition, and for reputation within the regiment. Being known as the most aggressive, most effective, and most feared troop carries status. These 4 factors, mission incentives, cultural exposure, isolation, and competition, created the institutional gateway. What the system offered was power, status, and belonging in an environment where normal moral constraints were weakened. What the system required in exchange was results. For most operators, this exchange meant working harder, taking more risks, and pushing operational tempo. They followed the rules of engagement while operating in morally ambiguous terrain. But for some, the gateway opened to something else. Between 2009 and 2013, across multiple Special Air Service rotations in Afghanistan, a pattern emerged. It started small, questionable shootings explained as combat necessity, prisoners treated roughly during processing,
rules of engagement interpreted creatively to justify kills. Then it escalated. Some operators began developing what they called blooding rituals, forcing new soldiers to execute prisoners to get their first kill.
Others began carrying throwdown weapons, untraceable AK-47 rifles and grenades that could be placed on bodies to justify killings.
Some began treating missions as hunting expeditions, referring to targets as squirters, and keeping informal kill counts. The soldier from Perth was among those who embraced the escalation.
According to the Brereton Report, the 4-year investigation into Australian war crimes in Afghanistan, he became known within his troop for a particular innovation. He developed a method for field executions that other operators began copying. The method was simple, efficient, and entirely illegal. During compound searches, when Afghan males of fighting age were detained, he would separate individuals from the group. His justification followed a pattern. The individual matched intelligence criteria, posed a threat, was attempting to flee, or displayed hostile intent. What happened next was documented through multiple witness testimonies. The individual would be forced to kneel. Sometimes hands were zip-tied, sometimes they were not. The execution was performed at close range, with a single shot, typically to the head or upper body. The weapon used was often a suppressed pistol or rifle to minimize noise. After the killing, a throwdown weapon would be placed near the body. The radio call would describe the incident as enemy killed in action. This was not battlefield combat. This was not split-second decision-making under fire. This was calculated procedural killing, executed with the same professional competence applied to every other aspect of special operations. The innovation was not the killing itself. Extrajudicial executions during counterinsurgency operations have occurred in every modern conflict. The innovation was systematizing it, making it routine, turning it into a troop practice that new members were expected to participate in. Between 2009 and 2013, investigators later documented at least 39 Afghan civilians and prisoners killed in this manner by his troop alone. But the pattern that emerged from witness testimony revealed something more disturbing than the method itself. It revealed his emotional relationship with the killings. According to soldiers who deployed with him, he displayed no hesitation, no visible distress, and no emotional aftermath. Other operators who participated in the executions, under pressure from unit leadership or peer dynamics, showed signs of psychological strain. They drank heavily, they withdrew, they struggled. He didn't. One soldier testified that after a compound raid resulting in 3 executions, the team returned to base. While other members sat in silence or tried to process what they had participated in, he was joking with another operator, relaxed and energized. Another soldier described watching him execute a detained Afghan male who had been cleared by the interpreter as a non-combatant. The individual was forced to kneel in a field. He shot him once in the chest. The individual collapsed but remained alive. He chambered another round and fired again. Then he returned to the patrol as if the event had been a routine equipment check. A third soldier described an incident where he bloodied a new squadron member, forcing the younger soldier to execute a prisoner as an initiation. After the killing, while the new soldier was visibly shaken, he clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Welcome to the real war." These were not aberrant moments of combat stress. These were patterns repeated across multiple deployments, multiple missions, multiple victims. The psychological profile that emerges from the testimony is one of emotional congruence violation. While his fellow soldiers experienced moral distress, he felt satisfaction. While others needed alcohol or compartmentalization to manage their participation, he needed neither. While others avoided discussing the killings after missions, he referenced them casually. The juxtaposition is what creates the disturbance. The other soldiers' discomfort proved they understood, on some level, that what they were doing violated their moral architecture. His comfort proves something different. He had crossed into a psychological space where the killings were not violations to be managed, but activities to be performed well. But the pattern reveals something even more disturbing when we examine the specific victims. Among the 39 documented killings attributed to his troop, investigators identified specific cases through witness testimony and forensic analysis. One was a man named Ali John, 42 years old,
father of 6, farmer in Uruzgan province. On September 11, 2012, Australian Special Air Service soldiers raided his compound during a partnered operation with Afghan forces. Ali Jan was detained along with 2 other men. According to witnesses, he was separated from the others, walked to the edge of the compound, and was shot twice. A PKM machine gun was placed next to his body. The radio report classified him as enemy killed in action.
The reason we know his name is that his family filed a complaint with Afghan authorities. The investigation found no evidence Ali Jan had any Taliban affiliation.
His detention was based on a neighbor's accusation, later revealed to be a property dispute. He was an unarmed farmer detained during a raid who was executed to inflate the troops' kill count.
Another was a teenager named Haji Sar Taze, aged estimated at 15 to 17. He was detained during a night raid in Helmand province in June 2013.
According to Australian soldiers who witnessed the incident, he was detained carrying no weapons. He was pulled aside during processing. He was shot in the head at close range. The official report listed him as a military-age male killed while attempting to escape. Afghan witnesses later testified that Haji Sartaiz was intellectually disabled. He had been sleeping when the raid began. He did not understand what was happening. He spoke to the interpreter in confused fragments. He was killed not because he posed a threat, but because he was available. A third case involved 2 men detained during a compound search. Both were zip-tied and placed under guard while the team cleared the rest of the structure. According to a soldier who testified in the inquiry, one of the SAS operators approached the detainees, spoke briefly to the interpreter, then shot both men in succession. When questioned, he explained that they looked like trouble. No throwdown weapons were used. The bodies were left in place. The mission report made no mention of the killings. The investigation never identified these 2 victims. They remain in the documentation as unknown Afghan males, case 17. These were not combatants killed in firefights. These were not split-second decisions under ambush. These were human beings with names, families, lives, who encountered Australian Special Operations soldiers and were killed for reasons ranging from operational convenience to recreational cruelty. And from the documented evidence, the soldier from Perth who pulled the trigger felt nothing. But human systems have a limit. Even in isolated special operations units operating in remote war zones with minimal oversight, patterns eventually surface. The first warning signs appeared in 2012 when an Afghan investigation into civilian casualties in Uruzgan province identified Australian forces. The Australian Defence Force opened an inquiry. Initial findings were inconclusive, conflicting testimony, lack of physical evidence, and operational security preventing detailed investigation. But within the SAS itself, soldiers began talking. Not to authorities, to each other. Some operators from other troops began to understand that what was happening in certain teams was not normal combat. Stories circulated about blooding the FNGs, forcing new guys to get kills. Whispers about throwdown weapons became open secrets. The killings were known about, but the institutional incentives prevented reporting. The SAS culture prioritized loyalty to the team above all else. Soldiers who raised concerns were labeled weak, unreliable, and unsuitable for special operations. Careers could end. Reputations could be destroyed. The code of silence held. Until one soldier broke it. In 2016, 3 years after the final Afghanistan rotation, a Special Air Service operator contacted military investigators. He provided detailed testimony about specific incidents he had witnessed. He named names. He described methods. He identified victims. The Australian Defence Force could no longer ignore it. In 2016, the Chief of the Defence Force commissioned an inquiry led by Major General Paul Brereton, a judge and military officer tasked with investigating rumors of war crimes by Australian Special Operations Forces in Afghanistan. The investigation lasted 4 years. Brereton's team conducted 423 interviews with witnesses, reviewed thousands of pages of operational reports and intelligence documents, examined forensic evidence, and collaborated with Afghan investigators. The findings, released in November 2020, were devastating.
The Brereton report documented credible evidence of 39 unlawful killings of Afghan civilians and prisoners by Australian SAS soldiers. It identified 25 perpetrators and recommended 19 current or former soldiers be referred for criminal prosecution. The report described a pattern of behavior in which junior soldiers were required by their patrol commanders to shoot a prisoner in order to achieve the soldier's first kill, in a practice that was known as blooding. It documented the use of throwdown weapons to stage combat scenarios. It identified a culture within certain Special Air Service troops where the law of armed conflict was disregarded and a self-centered warrior culture was embraced. The soldier from Perth was among those named. In March 2023, he was charged by the Australian Federal Police with 1 count of war crime murder under the Criminal Code Act 1995. The charge related to the killing of Ali John in September 2012. The preliminary hearing took place over 6 weeks in mid-2023. Prosecutors presented witness testimony from soldiers who deployed with him, forensic analysis of the incident site, communications intercepts from the mission, and Afghan witness statements.
The courtroom testimony revealed his demeanor. According to journalists who attended the proceedings, he sat impassive throughout. When witnesses described the executions, he showed no reaction.
When photographs of Ali John's family were displayed, his widow, his 6 children, he looked at the screen without expression. When the prosecution presented evidence of the throwdown weapon planted at the scene, he leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. During the cross-examination of a former teammate who testified that he had ordered the execution, he took notes calmly on a legal pad. His lawyer argued operational necessity, combat stress, and ambiguous rules of engagement. He nodded along as if the testimony concerned someone else. At no point during the 6 weeks of testimony did he display remorse, distress, or acknowledgement of the human cost described in the courtroom. One Afghan witness, a cousin of Ali John, testified via video link. He described Ali John's children asking when their father would return. He described the family's financial collapse after the primary earner was killed. He described finding Ali John's body with the planted weapon beside it. The soldier from Perth looked at his legal pad during the entire testimony. The judge noted his demeanor. The defendant has shown no emotional response to testimony describing the killing of unarmed civilians. This court observes a remarkable absence of affect. But the most psychologically revealing moment came during a pre-trial psychiatric evaluation. As part of the defense strategy, his legal team arranged a psychological assessment to evaluate potential PTSD or combat-related mental health conditions that might provide mitigating context. The psychiatrist's report, portions of which were entered into evidence, described the evaluation sessions. The soldier from Perth discussed his deployments in clinical terms. He described combat engagements with tactical precision. He acknowledged participating in the killings, but framed them as operationally justified. When asked how he felt about the Afghan civilians who died, he responded, "I was doing my job. They were in the wrong place." When asked if he thought about Ali John's family, he said, "That's not relevant to the tactical situation." When pressed on whether he experienced guilt or regret, he said, "Guilt is a luxury." "We were at war," the psychiatrist noted. The defendant displays no evidence of post-traumatic stress disorder or moral injury. His affect when discussing the killings is consistent with someone describing routine professional tasks. He appears to have internalized a framework in which these actions are categorized as normal combat operations, despite their clear violation of the laws of armed conflict.
The evaluation continued. When asked to consider the perspective of the victims' families, the defendant demonstrated limited capacity for empathic engagement. He repeatedly returned to operational justifications. There is no indication of psychological distress related to these events.
The report concluded, the defendant does not appear to experience remorse. He appears to genuinely believe his actions were appropriate. This is the psychological reality that makes the case so disturbing. He does not believe he did anything wrong. The institutional framework, the small group dynamics, the competitive culture, the mission incentives, all of these shaped his behavior. But at some point, he internalized the framework so completely that even now, Removed from the operational environment, he cannot access the moral categories that would generate remorse. He has constructed a self-justification so totalizing that the legal proceedings, the victim testimony, the evidence of planted weapons, the documented executions, none of it penetrates. And the self-justification follows a recognizable pattern. It is the same cognitive architecture that appears in every institutional atrocity, the subordination of individual moral judgment to role-based identity. He was an SAS operator. SAS operators eliminate threats. The individuals he killed were designated as threats by the operational framework. Therefore, eliminating them was not murder, but mission accomplishment. This reasoning is coherent within its own internal logic. It is also morally bankrupt, because the framework ignores several inconvenient realities. First, the individuals killed were not threats. Ali John was a farmer. Haji Sartez was a disabled teenager. The two unknown males in Case 17 were zip-tied detainees. None posed imminent danger. The threat designation was applied retroactively to justify killings that had already been decided. Second, the operational framework itself was violated. Australian rules of engagement prohibited the execution of detainees. Military law prohibited the killing of prisoners. Even within the institutional system he claims justified his actions, the actions were illegal. Third, the self-justification requires denying the humanity of the victims. To maintain the narrative that these were legitimate combat killings, he must categorize Afghan civilians as interchangeable enemy combatants. This categorization is the foundation of the self-justification, and it is the same dehumanization mechanism that appears in every systematic atrocity. The trial exposed all of this. Witness testimony demonstrated the killings were not combat. Forensic evidence proved the weapons were planted. Afghan testimony provided the victims' identities and lives. The legal framework definitively classified the actions as war crimes, and his response to all of it was, "I was doing my job." The cognitive dissonance between his self-perception and the documented reality is the philosophical core of the case. How does a competent, intelligent, professionally trained soldier, someone who can navigate complex tactical operations, manage teams under pressure, and operate sophisticated weapon systems, simultaneously fail to recognize that executing unarmed detainees is murder? The answer is that institutional systems are extraordinarily effective at overriding individual moral judgment. When the institution provides an identity, elite warrior, a mission, eliminate threats, a culture, aggressive, competitive, results-oriented, and an environment, isolated, high autonomy, low oversight. Individual soldiers do not have to consciously choose evil.
They just have to follow the institutional logic to its conclusion, and some soldiers follow it further than others. The trial concluded in November 2023. The judge delivered the verdict in January 2024. Guilty of war crime murder under Section 268.70 of the Criminal Code Act 1995. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. The soldier from Perth stood at attention, hands clasped behind his back, expression neutral. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, he declined. Sentencing occurred 2 weeks later.
The prosecution argued for the maximum penalty. The defense argued for leniency based on his service record, combat deployments, and institutional pressures. Character witnesses, fellow soldiers, former commanders, testified to his professionalism, his tactical competence, and his dedication to the mission.
None testified to his remorse because there was none to testify to. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment with a non-parole period of 27 years. In the sentencing remarks, the judge stated, "This was not a split-second decision under fire.
This was a deliberate, calculated execution of an unarmed civilian. The defendant's actions brought dishonor to the Australian Defence Force, violated the laws of armed conflict, and demonstrated a profound disregard for human life."
The absence of remorse indicates a defendant who has not begun to reckon with the gravity of his actions. The sentence was the harshest ever imposed on an Australian soldier for war crimes. He was transferred to a maximum security facility to begin serving the sentence.
Under Australian law, he would be eligible for parole consideration in 2051, at which point he would be 66 years old. But the story does not end with the imprisonment, because the sentence raises a question that the legal system cannot fully answer. What does justice mean when the perpetrator does not believe he did anything wrong?
For Ali John's family, the verdict provided some acknowledgement. The Australian government issued a formal apology and established a compensation fund for victims' families. Ali John's widow received a settlement. His children received educational support. But Ali John is still dead. His children still grew up without a father.
The compensation does not resurrect him. For the Australian Defence Force, the Brereton Report and the subsequent trials forced an institutional reckoning. The SAS underwent restructuring. New oversight mechanisms were implemented. Training protocols were revised to emphasize the law of armed conflict.
Officers who enabled the culture were quietly retired, but 39 Afghans are still dead. The institutional reforms do not bring them back. For the soldier from Perth, the life sentence means decades in prison. He will spend his middle age and elderly years in a cell. The institutional identity that defined him, elite SAS operator, has been stripped away.
He is now a convicted war criminal, but he still believes he was doing his job. The prison where he serves his sentence is a medium security facility outside Canberra.
According to prison officials, he maintains a disciplined routine. He exercises daily. He reads military history. He keeps to himself. Other inmates report that he does not discuss the case. When asked about his conviction, he describes it as a political prosecution. He maintains that the killings were operationally justified and that the trial was a betrayal of soldiers who did difficult work in an ambiguous war.
He has filed an appeal. The grounds are procedural: claims about the admissibility of evidence, witness credibility, and judicial instructions to the jury. The appeal does not argue innocence. It argues that the conviction was legally flawed. Legal experts expect the appeal to fail. If it does, he will remain in prison until at least 2051. During that time, he will age. His body, trained to elite special operations standards, will deteriorate.
The identity he built around being a warrior will become increasingly distant from the physical reality of a man in his 50s and 60s confined to a prison.
The question is whether this physical decline will ever be accompanied by moral reckoning. Will he, at some point in the next 27 years, access the emotional and cognitive space necessary to understand what he did?
Will he think about Ali John's children? Will he imagine Haji Sartez's confusion in the moments before his death? Will he reckon with the two unknown men in Case 17, whose names he never knew and whose deaths he never thought about?
The psychological research on perpetrators suggests the answer is likely no. Once a self-justification framework is fully internalized, it becomes extraordinarily resistant to revision. Admitting that the framework was wrong would require admitting that his entire identity as a professional soldier was built on a foundation of murder. That cognitive leap is almost impossible for most people to make. So he will likely serve his sentence believing he was wronged. He will believe the institution betrayed him. He will believe the legal system punished him for doing what the war required. And in that belief, he will remain, in a psychological sense, the same person he was in Afghanistan. The man who executed Ali John without hesitation. The man who blooded new soldiers by forcing them to kill prisoners.
The man who joked after killings while his teammates sat in traumatized silence. He has not changed. He is just confined.
But there is a broader question the case forces us to confront. The soldier from Perth was not unique. The Brereton Report identified 25 perpetrators across multiple ASS troops. The institutional culture that enabled the killings was pervasive enough that dozens of soldiers witnessed war crimes and said nothing for years. This was not one bad operator. This was a systemic failure. The Australian SAS, one of the world's most respected special operations forces, developed an internal culture where executing prisoners became routine, where blooding rituals were normalized, where kill counts were an informal competition, where younger soldiers learned that this was what elite warfighting looked like. How does that happen? The answer lies in the same institutional mechanisms we have traced throughout this analysis. Elite military units are built on intense group cohesion. The selection process is designed to create soldiers who trust each other absolutely, who prioritize the team above all else, and who internalize unit identity as central to self-identity. This cohesion is operationally essential. It is what allows small teams to operate effectively in high-risk environments. But the same cohesion that creates operational effectiveness also creates insularity.
When the team becomes the moral universe, external rules become theoretical. When unit reputation becomes the metric of success, competition overrides constraint. When loyalty to teammates is the highest value, reporting misconduct becomes betrayal.
Add to this the mission set of counterinsurgency. Unlike conventional warfare with clear enemies and defined battlefields, counterinsurgency is ambiguous. The enemy is indistinguishable from civilians. Threat assessment is subjective. Rules of engagement are complex and situationally dependent. Every engagement requires judgment calls. In this environment, aggressive interpretation of rules becomes tactically rewarded. The troop that kills more enemies gets more mission assignments. The operators who are willing to bend the rules get results that cautious operators do not. Over time, bending becomes breaking. Breaking becomes standard procedure. Layer on top of this the cultural factor. Australian forces operated alongside Afghan National Army units and local militias who had different cultural norms about prisoners and combatants. Witnessing Afghan partners execute prisoners normalized the practice. If the Afghans could do it, why couldn't the Australians? Finally, the institutional oversight failed. Senior officers either did not know or did not want to know. After-action reports were filed with sanitized language. Investigations were cursory. The command structure prioritized operational tempo over accountability. The result was a system where war crimes became routine. And the soldier from Perth was the product of that system. This does not excuse his actions. He made choices. He pulled triggers. He killed unarmed men. The institutional context explains how it happened, but it does not absolve individual responsibility. But it does reveal a disturbing truth. The distance between a professional soldier and a war criminal is smaller than we want to believe. Give ordinary soldiers an elite identity, an ambiguous mission, an isolated environment, a competitive culture, and weak oversight, and some percentage of them will cross the line.
Not all. Most Australian SAS soldiers who deployed to Afghanistan followed the rules of engagement. Most experienced moral distress when they witnessed violations. Most maintained their ethical boundaries, even in the most difficult operational environments.
But not enough. Enough that 39 Afghans died. Enough that an institutional culture of impunity developed. Enough that the Australian Defence Force had to reckon with the fact that its most elite unit had committed systematic war crimes. The contemporary warning this case offers is not about Australia specifically. It is about the mechanisms that enable this pattern in any military force, in any conflict, in any institutional environment where power is concentrated and oversight is weak. The same dynamics that produced the soldier from Perth exist in special operations forces around the world. The same mission sets, the same isolation, the same competitive culture, the same potential for institutional capture. Every nation that deploys elite forces in counterinsurgency environments faces the same risk. The question is, what prevents the slide from aggressive tactics to war crimes? The answer is not better selection. The soldier from Perth passed the same selection as hundreds of other operators who never committed atrocities. The answer is not better training. He received the same training in the law of armed conflict as everyone else. The answer is accountability. The only reliable check on institutional capture is external oversight that cannot be avoided or circumvented. When soldiers know that their actions will be investigated, that witnesses will be protected, and that violations will be prosecuted, the calculus changes. When soldiers know that the institution will protect them from consequences, that loyalty to the team overrides legal obligations, and that aggressive operators get promoted while cautious ones get sidelined, the calculus changes in the other direction. The Australian SAS in Afghanistan operated for years in an environment where the second calculus prevailed. The institutional reforms implemented after the Brereton Report attempted to shift to the first calculus.
More oversight, better reporting mechanisms, protected disclosure for witnesses, criminal accountability for perpetrators. Whether these reforms succeed will depend on whether they survive contact with the next deployment, the next conflict, the next generation of operators who will face the same pressures and temptations.
Because the mechanisms that produce the soldier from Perth are still available, the institutional gateway is still there, the competitive culture still exists. The mission sets that create moral ambiguity have not gone away. The only thing preventing the next iteration is the institutional will to maintain accountability, and that will is always fragile. Here's my question for you. When does professional military aggression cross the line into war crimes? Where is the boundary between doing a hard job in a morally ambiguous war and becoming a perpetrator? And what does it say about military institutions that they can transform competent, disciplined soldiers into people capable of executing unarmed civilians without remorse?
Drop your thoughts in the comments. If this changed how you see elite military forces, hit that like button and subscribe for more history that examines the uncomfortable truths about warfare. Thanks for watching.